Hello and welcome to Movie Marathon Mood. It's the show where we watch a bunch of movies and then we talk about them. It's as simple as that. On this episode, we're talking 1921 horror films. 100 years old, we're starting with The Phantom Carriage, then Destiny, and finally, a short film, The Haunted House. It's a lot to talk about, and it's all right here on Movie Marathon Mood, which starts right now. Hi, I'm Jesse Gilstrap, and I had so much fun, probably too much fun, talking about the top three grossing films of 1921. And I've already made a list of films I'm going to be talking about next year in 2022. 100 years old movies from, of course, 1922 at that point, because I see no point in stopping this. This is one of my favorite things that we've done on this show is talking about films of 100 years. And what a great excuse to look back at silent cinema, the beginnings of movies and the beginnings of so many different things. And speaking of that sort of thing, the beginning of something, our first movie is The Phantom Carriage, which has often been called the first horror movie. And something that's worth pointing out right out of the gate is that these three movies, two features and one short film that we're talking about here, they're the horror is a component of it, which could be said of a lot of horror films even today. That you have a mixture of genres or different kinds of things going on in a movie. Oftentimes, the thing that's added on is action, something that can irritate me in the wrong context when you have too much action in a horror movie and it stops becoming terror. It stops becoming horror. And it's like, what are we doing? This is more an action movie than anything else. But what's important right here is that we're talking the very beginnings of horror as a genre. So all these movies have something else going on, but horror is definitely a component of them. And there are characteristics that help define horror as a genre. One of the things that's going to be fun as I continue to look at 100-year-old movies in the years to come is that evolution of horror specifically, and obviously other characteristics in movies as well. But horror as a genre is really in its cinematic infancy, and yet the Phantom Carriage had so much going on that really makes it such an influential movie. I mean, Charlie Chaplin is one of the people who loves this movie. Ingmar Bergman clearly borrowed so much of his own style. Bergman's one of the all-time great filmmakers in his own right, and it's interesting. Bergman's not so much a horror director, and The Phantom Carriage isn't explicitly just a horror movie, and yet you can see an influence in this movie on Bergman. And apparently, Bergman liked it so much he watched it at least once a year, which is saying an awful lot. To be fair, Destiny has a lot of things that I can see in Bergman's work as well. There's just something kind of richly philosophical, psychological happening in these movies that's willing to deal with supernatural or underlying psychological conditions, and there's willing to confront darkness within a person. And obviously, that's a characteristic of horror, but it's also a characteristic of a lot of richer drama as well. But The Phantom Carriage is one of those movies that I feel like it's pretty immediately obvious that this movie is very much made by somebody with a cinematic eye and with a lot to say as well. The story itself is very much at its core, the basic story is about a guy who is confronting his own darkness in a way that he has ignored his family throughout so much of his life. And one of the big things that's happening is there's this woman who is dying that is connected to this main character, David. The woman I don't know how to pronounce her name for sure, and it's a silent movie, so they don't do me any help, is Edith. But she is dying and wanting to speak with David. And he has become this drunken mess, which also speaks to something I'll be bringing up later, too, which is a connection to The Shining and Stanley Kubrick. It's really kind of fun sometimes when you look back in cinematic history and see the movies that influenced the filmmakers that you know, and that tradition continues on because this movie partially inspired The Shining, and The Shining has inspired so many other people past that point, and the cycle just continues, of course. But what's interesting is you see immediately how selfish David is, and something that I find funny is that standards and practices at the time probably wouldn't have been so happy to deal with not just darkness but with the supernatural specifically, and that's just something people say a big no to, uh, and yet at the same time, this is very much a movie that I don't see why there would be much objection to it at all, just in terms of its philosophy and what it's actually building to, which is a very positive, life affirming kind of message. There's something inherently positive in it, but yes, the supernatural aspect and the horror of it comes down to, you might wonder what the title is directly referring to, and it's this kind of fable tale that the last person who dies in a given year has to ride and drive the Phantom Carriage for death. Um, Speaking of Bergman, if you think about the Seventh Seal and Death as a character, Death is very much a character in our next movie we'll be talking about, and in this one is not exactly a character. What you see is people standing in for Death, who is talked about as if Death is a character, but not directly seen. What we see instead is the Phantom Carriage itself, uh, and it starts off with our main character and guys like getting drunk in a graveyard, and that's when they tell each other about this story, and it's in some ways humorous, and at the same time there's this creepy darkness happening under the surface as well. But yeah, getting drunk in a graveyard, that's certainly something that I know a lot of people have done, or just hanging out and telling creepy stories in a graveyard. But the whole idea of, they don't necessarily believe this story until David is quite possibly dead and going and the last person to be dead in this specific year, and needing to go and collect souls for a year. And that visual and that concept is certainly the largest horror aspect of this movie, and it's something that happened before the effect itself happened, before there were optical effects. So you're talking double exposure, triple exposure of film, trying to make this transparency happen of the Phantom Carriage itself and the characters walking through this world. And there's some effective imagery, especially the pulling of a soul basically out of a body, and it makes for an effective, obvious ploy in terms of yet these people were very much dead, their spirits, and are walking out of their body. That probably could make some people flip out at the time in terms of seeing that happen on the screen. Not so much today in terms of concept. We have too many visual effects today where it'd be hard to like impress upon somebody like, wow, look at that, somebody's transparent on the screen. And I'm not trying to condemn this movie for that effect. Part of the point is historical context. But I will say that the visuals in this movie, I think, are very strong. overall. It's one of the, again, cinematic aspects of the movie. And I bring that up partially because, some of the movies that we watching in the three highest grossing movies of 1921, the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse or Three Musketeers, they had some good moments or good scenes, but they weren't explicitly cinematic in their filmmaking. And this one feels, it might be weird to say, but it feels like a movie. You can tell why this would be so influential to future filmmakers, because there's clearly thought put behind the environments and the sets and the cinematography, the staging of the actors in the frame. There's something actually happening with the psychology of the shots, and again, as simple as that might be to say, it's evident that there is some very strong filmmaking at play in this movie, and that's also to speak to the tinting. When we talk about older movies, one of the first scenes that a lot of people will reference is black and white, and there is black and white in this movie, but there's also a lot of tinting. Like specifically, if you're outside at nighttime, you'll have that blue hue to it, and that sort of thing is done just tinting the entire frame, but obviously done to give an effect, so that you are outside at nighttime. You get an immediate idea of where you are just based on that tinting alone. The concept of going around and collecting souls is really effective and quite dark. I mean, there is other darkness in this as well, including a suggestion of suicide. That's something that happens in here a couple of times, where characters are potentially going to kill themselves. And that's, I mean, more than the supernatural things, that's something you think there would be a concern about. And yet at the same time, what would people be most concerned about in 1921? It would be the supernatural stuff. They weren't going to be as concerned about the potential for suicide. That's just a dramatic conceit. The fact that there's death coming and collecting those souls is a whole other thing. And when death is doing its job, it's just a job. There's something very distanced about it. And I don't mean to keep bringing up the second movie so often, but that's also true in Destiny as well. Is death is just there to do its part. Death is not really causing people to end up dead. It's just a function of his job to collect the dead. And there's something distant and cold about that. It's also matter of fact as well. You don't have to see it as a dark thing. You could just see it as a fact of our existence, that we will die someday. And death is there to collect our souls when it happens. But obviously that can very much be a chilling concept as well, especially if you were to see death. And as characters do in these movies, is to say, like, I'm not ready yet. Hold on a second. Give me a second before you take me. But so much of the story is, David looking back at his own life, and I can't help but be reminded of like Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol, and the concept of looking back at one's life, and death being the one, in this case, an apparition being the one leading that sort of thought process, saying like, maybe you should consider who you are. And I feel like it shouldn't be a huge spoiler to say that at the end of this, David comes out the other side wishing to be a better person, learning from the error of his ways and wanting to be good. And there's an inherent lack of selfishness when he comes through this experience of kind of being forced to look at his drunkenness and the way he neglected his own family. And the truth is, neglect would be a bit too simplistic of a way of putting it, because the big image that does come up that people could directly look at in terms of Kubrick being inspired by this movie is the image of David using an axe to get to his family and cutting through a door, trying to chop down a door to get to his family, which is in itself a very haunting kind of image. And he's drunk, and that's another thing that connects us back to The Shining, is this man going mad, his drunkenness kind of perpetuating that, and in essence making his own family very sad and despondent as well, to a point of his wife wanting to end it all. Again, coming back to that idea of suicide. And it's important to note that as I'm bringing up these elements, I'm bringing it up partially to be like, God, there's horror in this story, but it's also a dramatic story. There's drama and fantasy and horror, and these elements kind of coalesce with each other. This isn't a movie that's strictly going for the chilling effect. It's telling a tale, and the horror is just a component of it. And at the same time, there's obvious reasons why people have called this the first horror movie, because of how well it utilizes those dark elements and the supernatural components, up to and including just having to be a witness to some of the darkness, as David's most at point looking back on his life, but then eventually looking at current time just as an apparition. And the person who has been leading the carriage isn't just a stranger. It's somebody who has blamed himself for leading David to be a drunkard. He's kind of blamed himself not just for his own bad behavior, but for causing David to be in this life as well, which is probably a bit too harsh in some ways. But not to say that it's not worth considering as well. The way that we can have enough impact, we can have an impact on those around us, and the darkness that can kind of spread from our own errors and our own mistakes. But at the same time, like, obviously there are plenty of alcoholics out there, and that can be a serious issue. Drunkenness can be a really big issue to anyone that becomes dependent upon it and have that disease. But as far as like one of the things that make this, not that removes it from darkness, but something that definitely makes the story a morality tale. In so many ways, this is a morality tale. It's a character confronting their own demons. I'm not literally demons, but yeah, there are obviously some stories will literally confront demons, but in some horrors specifically, but not so much literal demons as somebody being forced to look at their own darkness, their own immorality, and wishing to become a better person. That's a very good message at the end of the day. So anybody that might have had an issue with this in terms of just daring to look at the supernatural would do good to actually look at this in a deeper way, which there's plenty to consider when you're watching this movie. It's just an overall really terrific, dramatic film. And not only that, it's easily available to find even like for free on YouTube. All of these movies you can find for free on YouTube. The Phantom Carriage has been made available by the Criterion Collection, has really terrific restoration that was done for it. And to be fair, Destiny also looks really good as well. It actually had its own restoration that was done, and that sort of film preservation is important, especially for movies that are now 100 years old. And looking at this one, like, considering its vintage and everything it's been through, it looks very good. And I have to say too that just sometimes things I miss about the silent era, just in terms of like when you have an iris in on something and that kind of trick that can be employed. Uh, we don't always see enough done with transitions and so forth in a lot of modern cinema, but there are heightened stylistic tricks that are done in these kinds of movies that, in my opinion, really do a lot for them. Phantom Carriage is, to me, an easy A plus, and something that cinephiles should definitely check out, not just because of its import in who it inspired moving forward, but in and of itself, just a well done, interesting movie. And you could, I mean, if you're really wanting to pick apart some of the effects, there's some minor details and things that you could pick apart, but I feel like, considering that there was very little that could be done in 1921. Again, no optical effects or anything, certainly no computer graphics, obviously, but not even certain rudimentary tricks. It's quite a magic trick to have done even what they did. And there had to be a lot of time put into that to make that happen. And at the end of the day, the movie is inspired. It is more than its trickery. It's a legitimate dramatic story of a legitimately dramatic story that is willing to confront some darkness that can exist in humanity and the consequences of that in a fabled kind of way. But that brings us to the next movie on the roster, which is Destiny, which I've already referenced several times. And yes, it does indeed have the same concept underneath of death as a character. In this case, very much a main character, and a really strong main character, visually arresting presence that is simultaneously ominous and yet potentially warm, which speaks again to that characteristic that is distanced from humanity, distance from the job, rather, not even distance from humanity, but distance from just the job at hand. Like, it's time for you to die, and it's time for you to die. And in Destiny, that concept is even colder in terms of death's job. That people actually are, when it is actually your time to go, it is your time to go. And well, I say that essentially plays games in this story as well. Uh, so I get, in a certain sense, you could say that he isn't completely distanced, because he's pretty immediately toying with the community, including this wall that appears in this town that Death is essentially toying with some of the local community. Like, what is this wall? How do you get in this wall? And speaking of ominous, that is quite an immediately ominous thing, and it proves to be deserving of being ominous, because that's where the dead enter, and it appears to be a gateway to Death's lair. And at one point, our lead character, this woman who is deeply in love, and next thing you know, sees her husband dead and moving along with other spirits, apparitions, into this wall with Death. And she manages to get into that layer herself and tries to confront Death about bringing her husband back. And part of what's interesting about this story is that, unlike in the Phantom Carriage, where our main character had a lot of darkness himself, that he was, creating this toxic environment for his family and everyone around him. And that's what the story is confronting. In Destiny, it's not so much that this woman has been leading a dark life up to this point, and uh, it's more of her being forced to wrestle with her own destiny and to consider uh, the cost of life, the cost of death, and the inevitability of that, and the selfishness of trying to want life back, wanting her husband back. Not that you shouldn't want the people you love to come back, but what does that really mean? And especially to think that you are somehow above death or above those sort of choices. And that's kind of the fascinating undercurrent, especially once you get to the end of the story and you realize, like, wow, they weren't kidding around in a certain sense, in terms of the ultimate message. Because when she enters into this layer, which is really neat. Once again, you're talking. I mean, Fritz Lang made this movie, and Fritz Lang is known for this movie, but also Ilm and Metropolis among his credits. Those are the two even bigger ones than this in terms of what people might know today. But Destiny is still high on that list in terms of his movies, and is full of great images, great cinematic images, and including neat tricks, including the double, triple, whatever exposure they had to do to create the uh, transparent effects at points, or you also have later in the movie and things like a flying carpet and that kind of thing as well, which is one of the reasons Douglas Fairbanks bought this movie's American rights, is because he wanted the ability to use those effects in his own movie, The Thief of Baghdad. He thought the effects are so impressive. He's like, I don't really care necessarily about releasing the movie as much as utilizing the effects, but uh, it's not like the movie never came out in the U.S. But it did take a while for it to come out in the States. At the same time, it wasn't super uncommon for movies sometimes to take a while to have releases around the world, or even just around countries. It's not like there were a whole lot of screens at that point. Movies earned their money over time because they traveled. And The Phantom Carriage is a Swedish movie, and Destiny is a German movie, which also very much speaks to the international nature of horror, and specifically back then, horror eventually very much comes into the Hollywood system, but horror didn't originate in cinema so much in the Hollywood American system. Nonetheless, the visuals in Destiny are just all around terrific, and one of my favorite is just Death's layer with the candles, and the candles are meant to represent the souls of different people all around the world. Some closer to burning out than others. And when your candle burns out, it's time for death to come and collect you. And that's that. And at the core of Destiny structure, which it's ultimately told in 6 chapters. That's another thing that exists in these movies, is being told in parts, very kind of literary. These titles being very literary in their nature, and as far as being divided into chapters. And this one, Destiny, is divided into what it calls 6 verses, and 3 of those are the challenge that Death puts in front of this woman, to where she wants to bring her husband back. And there are 3 candles, so that each of them is representative of a soul that she is tasked with potentially helping. And that's also, speaking of international, we go from the Middle East to Italy, and then into China, throughout these three different parts of very unique cultural trip that we go on in this movie. And that's something that I couldn't help but think about, like early cinema sometimes being used for people to see things they've never seen before. And this movie definitely takes you on a trip, and just at least in terms of its story. Its story takes you on a trip through these different cultures and different ideas. I mean, it's, from all I can tell, it was all filmed in Germany, so it's not like they really traveled. But in terms of the production design and getting to see some unique concepts, including like the first one that's in the Middle East, it's in the middle of Ramadan. That's a really interesting dynamic to strike, and in each of these three tales, in each of these three lives, he's trying to save a soul. Uh, it becomes quite a game that Death is playing. I don't get the impression that Death is toying with people so much. I mean, I think there is a bit of a game aspect here, but if I had to define the dynamic, I guess it wouldn't so much be toying with people as it is kind of showing the nature of death and showing the nature of death's role in all of this, which is essentially like when it's your time to go, it's your time to go, and you can't play games. And that seems to kind of be this underlying idea and theme. And if I had to like measure the level of horror in these movies, Destiny is the least horror of the three movies I'm talking about in this episode. Uh, it obviously has horror as a component, uh, but so much of it, especially when you go to these different places, and I mean, at their core, it's about people that are about to die. So I guess you could always argue that that horror aspect is there, but there's something that's kind of, it's definitely even more of a fable and than the Phantom Carriage was, and just in terms of, and now I'm going to tell you a story. And what also seems interesting is the notion that time doesn't seem to matter so much either. And I think that's a philosophically interesting conceit, the idea that time doesn't matter so much throughout these stories. But when you deal with death in these different cultures, and death ends up popping up as a character that this woman is essentially trying to avoid at all turns. Death is there, and death might be a participant in killing someone or being a stand-in for someone who is killing, but death's role is seemingly passive. It just is a fact, and that's kind of the way it's treated. That this is essentially is going to happen because death is death, and she is just a woman, just a human being. It's not exactly, if you're going to say a fair fight, it's not exactly a fair fight. But I really liked seeing these trips to the Middle East and then to Italy and to China. Uh, there's something that's definitely, like I said, a fable. Like you're sitting down and being told a story. Uh, I really like that aspect of the storytelling, which is also intensely structured. Like I could get a rough idea of how long it's going to be for each of these stories or each of these six parts because they're all roughly the same duration. And I think it works too. Sometimes that kind of strict structure may not work for everyone. In this case, I feel it very much does. And this is a shorter movie than The Phantom Carriage as well. It breezes by, and that's not, obviously, I really like The Phantom Carriage, so it's not me dogging on that movie when I say that Destiny really breezes by. I mean, Lang is a first class filmmaker. Apparently, Destiny is the favorite film of Alfred Hitchcock. So once again, we're in that category of uh, some of our best filmmakers being inspired by these movies, by their ideas as well as their visuals. You know, Douglas Fairbanks pulled this movie for its visual tricks, but so many filmmakers weren't just inspired by the trickery; they were inspired by the ideas and the visuals, and the way that the visuals tell the story, and that is intensely at the. I mean, if you're talking about Alfred Hitchcock, it's one of the best filmmakers in cinematic history. Well, so is Fritz Lang, but Hitchcock is obviously watching a movie like this, not just impressed by the trickery; they're inspired by the way the trickery can tell the story, and the way that can get at the heart of a character. And when you get to the last part of the story, that's honestly the part that sold this whole movie on me. I mean, I was enjoying it all the way through, but the last part is what really sold me on it even more. And you see this woman given a choice to find within an hour a life to give to death. And you want to talk about a morality tale. This is a very different kind of morality tale than Destiny, because faced with directly having to look at people and say, would you give your life, even the rest of your life, older person, maybe someone that's not in that good of health or not in that good of a social status, would you give your life so I can have my loved one back? And it speaks to the selfishness of so many people to not consider the livelihoods of everyone around them. I've seen so many times people not care about their fellow man. I mean, just look at COVID. How many times people have looked at uh, who has died, and like you're talking over 1 million people worldwide that have died of this. Hundreds of thousands of people that have died in the United States, and even more internationally. And so many people say, oh, look, it's nothing to worry about. The death rate is really low. Meanwhile, millions of people are dead. And they say, oh, well, the people that are dead, they already had some type of underlying condition or something. You could argue that COVID's not even what really killed them. And that's not really true. They could have lived a lot more life, even with whatever condition. Maybe COVID exacerbated what was already there, but they would have survived and perhaps even thrived, and likely often would have thrived for years longer. And to want to steal that from somebody is an inherently selfish thing. Like, oh, can you please, uh, save the life of my beloved, my husband, because he's young and healthy and you've lived a good life. You don't need any more time. But people want to live. Often, most people, I'd say, maybe not everybody, not maybe not everybody always wants to live, but there is a beauty and a purity to the human experience and wanting to live. And part of what happens in this story is right at the end when a building catches on fire by accident, after she looks like a friggin' crazy person, saying, would anybody want to give their life for me so I can get my husband back? And they run. All these older people run away from her. That's not something that they're interested in. And then a fire starts, and there's something just hauntingly, absolutely beautiful about the ending of this story to me. I loved it, even though, there's something that doesn't happen, which is like actually confronting the pain of death or the potential horror of death in a sense of the torture and agony of death. That's not something that's at all confronted in Destiny. We're not talking about the full potential darkness and terror of violence of death. It's more just a matter of fact thing, reaching the end of our life. And at the same time, handling that way in that fabulistic sense, I think ultimately really works and is the perfect note to end this whole movie on. It is a gorgeous movie. If it's not evident already, I give it an A plus rating as well. So that's two A pluses in this episode. And just for the fun of it, I also found a short film that is again on YouTube, 20-minute long short film with Buster Keaton. Buster Keaton is one of my favorite people. I think he's hilarious and brilliant and very talented, like physical comedian, and the tricks that he employed are so clever so often. The Haunted House is a really fun delight of a story. There is nothing in it that, unlike the Phantom Carriage and Destiny, there's nothing truly supernatural happening in the haunted house. The idea is that the haunted house is not really haunted. It's a thieves' hideout. And before we even get there, because that's halfway through this 20-minute thing before we even get to, well, we briefly see the haunted house, but the bulk of the first 10 minutes is at this bank where Buster Keaton, one of the biggest things that happens, Buster Keaton ultimately makes a huge mess with glue, which is almost anxiety ridden to imagine like how quickly something like that could create an epic mess. But the physical comedy antics at play here are very funny, and watching Keaton trying to solve this impossible to solve situation before it ended up looking like he's the criminal and needing to escape. And that's where, of course, we end up eventually in a chase to this so-called haunted house. And ultimately, this isn't my favorite work of Buster Keaton, but it's still a fun thing to watch, and it's short too, so it's easy to watch. And what happens in the haunted house is, characters in sheets or in skeleton costumes and so forth, some spooky kind of imagery that happens in the haunted house, that Keaton is a frightened little character in the story, and ultimately trying to get out of this situation, including the steps that turn into a ramp at the pool of a lever. But he's perpetually entangled in this mess. And like I said, there are better examples of Buster Keaton, better examples of even just silent film era comedy, even more clever gags and other things. But it's not like the gags in the haunted house are bad. It's a fun, enjoyable short film that I definitely laughed while watching, and makes for a fun light edition if you're wanting to watch something from 100 years ago that's brief and easy to digest and enjoy in the Halloween season. I definitely recommend The Haunted House. It's got some fun tricks in there, and one of the funniest bits is right at the end when he is hallucinating, is knocked out for a moment and is hallucinating, and heaven rejects him, so he gets then sent down a ramp straight down to hell. And you want to talk about some horror imagery? Yeah, some big horror imagery of heaven rejecting you and being sent straight down to hell and being accepted in hell, that's definitely a horror image for you. But again, that's a hallucination. Nothing in this is explicitly supernatural. It's just fun, clever gags, and I would have to give it a solid B grade. It's fun. It's not the best, but it is a fun movie that made me smile. So ultimately, you're talking a fun, light short film that you can watch in these two uh, absolute classic 1921 movies that any cinephile should 100% check out. Not just for their influence, but in and of themselves as just great, well done movies. And also, in the spirit of the season, classics of their type, like fitting into the earliest of horror movies and the earliest example of horror as a cinematic genre. And that's something that very quickly will take hold in cinema. In the years that follow 1921, you get even more horror imagery, even greater, more explicitly horror titles, and I can't wait to explore that in the future and to explore just more in silent cinema in general. I hope that you will, if you're a movie person, that you will check that out, and even if you're not, to maybe, as always, expand your horizons and check something like that out. I think silent cinema is some of the best of movies out there and can be really creative, and there's a lot to pull from that era that I feel like a lot of people should check out stuff that is outside of their comfort zone. So wherever you stand on silent cinema, I hope you'll watch movies like The Phantom Carriage and Destiny, and certainly check out some Buster Keaton as well. But thanks for sticking in here with me. Hope to see you next time here on Movie Marathon Mood.